social reproduction, which is the reproduction of social relations as a whole in any society, is subsumed under capitalism for maximization of profits through the maximum extraction of surplus value. This is done in two ways. The first is through increasing what is pure unpaid work uh, to sustain the worker and the workers' families. And the second is to, of course, extend the unpaid labor time within paid labor time in the classical Marxist sense. Now, in India, social reproduction is mainly performed by women and Dalits. This social reproduction work in India is not limited to the focus on care work that is usually the concern in the advanced capitalist world. Instead, the boundaries between socially reproductive work and productive work is very thin. So, for example, gathering firewood, raising poultry, goat rearing, or growing vegetables for subsistence, all of this, as long as it is for subsistence, is pure, of course, unpaid work, but is on the cusp of the boundary between reproductive work and productive work. Social relations through which this entire structure is arranged is based on a combination of the interlinkage between caste and patriarchy, as pointed out by Ambedkar, which is control over the woman's body and her labor in order to do two things. The first is to maintain the purity of caste through endogamy and exogamy uh, practices, and the second is to control the labor of Dalits. Caste and patriarchy co-constitute social relations of class in the Marxist sense, in a way in which labor cheapening becomes the sole basis of capital accumulation in India. And so, this ability to extract such work leads to social reproduction being done at a very, very cheap rate. So, labor can be kept cheap. For every 100 rupees of value that is created today, 65% goes as surplus, while just 35% is that of that constitutes wages. It was just the opposite in the 1990s, when 35% was the surplus and 65% was wages. So you can see the extent of labor cheapening that has already happened in the pre-pandemic phase. And to give you some example, I'll just give you some data from a survey that is ongoing. 1,800 domestic workers in South Delhi, which is Southeast, South, and Southwest districts, and 300 sanitation workers in 2018-19. We found the extraction of unpaid work in different ways by assigning additional duties. So, for example, in the institutional context, the sanitation worker, apart from doing sanitation work, was made to sort of rearrange furniture, attend to work as what would be usually done by office attendants, and a range of other things like being pulled in to make arrangements for any kind of event, etc. Similarly, in the case of domestic work, there's also a lot of work that is imposed on women, which is not part of the initial oral contract. Now, all of this extraction of unpaid work within paid work, makes social reproduction cheaper, and thus wages can be cheapened, leading to a larger surplus. In this situation, during the pandemic, during the first lockdown, since 2020-21, we started following up with these workers we had interviewed and talked to before the pandemic. What we found was that a 50% had undergone full loss of wages during the two lockdowns. 90% had experienced partial loss of wages. 30% had lost their jobs totally. We could confirm that about 1% of people whom we could contact during the first phase had died in the process of trying to go home. And in about 20-25 case studies that we did we found that workers went back to their original professions, but at rates lower than what it was before the pandemic and for longer hours. So in this period of the pandemic, actually, extraction of unpaid work has increased to an extent where the labor cheapening process in social reproduction has led to the process which we have seen at the macro level, which is the compression of wages. The compression of wages that has been possible has one of the reasons, it's not the only reason, but one of the major reason, but which often goes unacknowledged, is because the workers in the social reproduction sector have been super exploited to the point where uh, the freezing of wages, wage cuts, or etc., have been easy to implement because the cost of social reproduction has been entirely borne by these domestic workers and sanitation workers